The snow had started falling before noon, thick and relentless, covering every inch of the mountain road in a blanket of white, and as I climbed higher, my tires slipped more with each turn, the old SUV groaning beneath me, and I had no signal, no GPS. No idea how close I really was to the cabin, but I knew one thing for certain. Had to get there before dark, because they said this storm could bury everything by morning. I was supposed to meet my best friend, Liam, and his mom for a winter weekend, up at their family's mountain retreat, and he had texted earlier saying he might be late. Caught up with something in town, but that his mom had already driven ahead and would be waiting at the cabin with the fire going, and I imagined it just as I remembered from the summer wooden porch swinging slowly in the wind. Tall pines encircling the house like quiet guardians, and the smell of cedar inside. Always fresh, always comforting, always. Her name was Clara, and she was nothing like any of the other moms I'd known growing up, and even though she'd raised Liam mostly alone after his dad passed, she carried herself like nothing ever touched her, with that graceful kind of strength and poise. And every time I visited them, I noticed little things like how she always smiled at the end of her sentences, or how her eyes met yours and stayed there, like they knew something you didn't and maybe didn't want to say. By the time I reached the cabin, the wind was howling like a living thing, and the sky had darkened to a deep bruised gray, the trees bending under the weight of snow, and I parked as close as I could, trudging up the porch steps with my bag thrown over my shoulder, my boots crunching with every step, and before I could knock, the door opened, and there she was, framed in warm golden light, wearing a heavy knit sweater and jeans, her hair loose and tousled, like she'd just run her fingers through it, and she smiled that slow, knowing smile and said, "I was wondering if you'd make it inside." The cabin, the fire was already blazing, the heat curling around the room like an embrace, and she took my coat and told me Liam had called and he'd be stuck in town until morning, maybe longer if the roads didn't clear, and then she poured 2 mugs of cocoa and sat across from me on the worn couch, her legs tucked beneath her as the storm whirled against the windows. We talked at first about simple things, about school and work and how the holidays were coming fast, and she asked if I'd been seeing anyone, and I laughed and shook my head and said, "Not really," and she tilted her head in that way she did when she was thinking, her fingers curled around the mug like it held something deeper than just warmth. The night settled thick and heavy around us, the storm outside growing louder and closer, like it was trying to get in, and we moved closer to the fire, her blanket draped over both our legs, and she laughed softly when I said it felt like a movie, like one of those snowed-in stories where strangers become something else, and she looked at me, not smiling this time, but serious and still, and said, "We're not strangers, are we?" There was a pause then, where the air between us felt electric, like the moment right before a match is struck, and I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just my best friend's mom, but the woman. She was the one who had always been there. I'm in the background of my life, steady and kind and breathtaking, in ways I had tried not to see, and yet here they were, filling the room between Ushu. Shh, reached out, then her hand brushing my knee, not by accident, and I didn't move, didn't speak, just felt that simple touch send something racing through my chest. And she leaned in, her voice low and warm as a fire, and said, "It's just you and me tonight, and it might be dangerous out there, but in here it feels safe, doesn't it?" And I nodded, because it did, because in that moment I didn't care about roads or snow or what tomorrow might bring. She moved closer, slowly, like she was giving me time to stop her, but I didn't, I couldn't, and when her lips brushed mine, was soft and curious and full of things we hadn't said, and when I kissed her back, it was like answering a question I hadn't known I'd been asked for years, and her fingers tangled in my hair, and I forgot everything but the way she felt, the way she tasted, the way her breath caught when I pulled her closer. We didn't rush. It didn't tear at the moment like something fleeting. Instead, we unfolded slowly, gently, like 2 pages being read together for the first time. Her hands tracing the shape of my face, my chest, my back, as if trying to memorize me, and I did the same. Learning the rhythm of her breath, the softness of her skin, the way she whispered my name like it was a secret. The fire crackled beside. Us, but the real heat was between our bodies as we moved together on that couch, wrapped in warmth and quiet urgency. The world outside disappearing in white and wind, and nothing existed but this moment. This connection, this spark that had waited so long to ignite later. As the storm raged louder, we found our way to the bedroom, the one with flannel sheets and windows, fogged by heat and snow, and we undressed each other slowly, reverently, and when I kissed her shoulder, she sighed my name again, and I held her close, as if I could keep the storm at bay with just the strength of my arms, and in the silence that followed. In the softness of tangled limbs and rising breath, she touched my face and whispered, "I don't know what this means." And I told her. I didn't either, but it felt real and it felt right, and that maybe we didn't have to know everything right now. We fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other while the wind howled and snow piled high around the cabin, and the heat from the fire flickered low, but the warmth between us held steady, strong, and unspoken. Morning came slow and pale with light, seeping through the curtains, and I woke before her, watching the way her hair spilled over the pillow, the way her lips curved even in sleep. And I knew something had shifted that night, something quiet but deep, like a river cutting a new path through. Stone she stirred and opened her eyes and smiled, and for a moment we just looked at each other as if remembering. And I reached for her and she didn't pull away, and we stayed like that for a long time, not speaking, just breathing the same air, and letting the silence say everything we couldn't. Roads wouldn't clear for another day, and we stayed close, wrapped in wool, and shared glances. Moving around the cabin like a dance, always touching, always near, and when the fire needed more. When I went out and she waited by the door, and when I came back she touched my cheek and said I was worried, and I kissed her hand and said, I came back for youth's second night, felt different, not new, but known, like we were slipping back into something we'd always been meant to find, and this time there was no hesitation, no doubt, only need, and the soft hush of skin against skin, and the way she gasped my name, like a promise when Liam finally called to say he couldn't make it until the next morning. She looked at me with something like worry, and I took her hands and told her we didn't have to figure it all out right now, that I wasn't going anywhere, and she said, I don't want you to, and neither of us said anything more, but we didn't need to. The last night came too quickly, the storm. It's finally beginning to quiet its rage, spent and outside. The world was soft and still, and inside we were wrapped in each other again. Not frantic, but slow and sure, like two people who had stopped pretending they didn't belong right here in this moment. When the morning came bright and clear, and Liam's truck crunched up the driveway, we stood in the kitchen, her fingers brushing mine as we poured coffee, and we exchanged a glance full of weight and wonder, and when he walked through the door, all windblown and grinning, she greeted him like always, but her eyes found mine over his shoulder and held there just a beat longer than necessary. That weekend passed, but something in us didn't fade, and when I hugged her goodbye before driving down the mountain, her arms lingered around me, her voice low in my ear as she said, be safe, and I said, always for you. Don't know what happens next, not exactly, but I know something started that night, something that couldn't be undone or ignored, and maybe it was the storm or the fire or just time finally catching up to truth, but I know this. When she held me close as the storm raged outside, something warmer ignited inside. Something neither of us could ever name, but both of us would always feel, and that warmth never left, even as the snow melted and the days passed and the world returned to normal, because something between us had changed, not loudly, not with fireworks, but with quiet certainty, and in every quiet moment after, I could still feel it. Her touch, her breath, her eyes telling me without words that whatever this was, it was real. It was ours. It was worth everything we had to risk to keep it alive. I will always remember that night when the wind howled and the fire burned and her arms wrapped around me with something deeper than comfort, something closer to love, something that once awakened never went cold again.